Hey everyone, welcome back to this mid-November edition of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We talked just a moment ago about the USC deadlines, the USC essays and the deadlines coming up on December 1st. We also spent some time in our first segment talking about what seniors can do if they're just getting started with this process now. And of course, you don't just apply to college, you also apply for financial aid, and you've got to pay for college at some point. And so we thought we'd pick up that same line of discussion from the first segment here in the final segment to talk all about what students should do now with respect to the financial aid process. So joining me today is one of my favorite guests from the finance team, Laurie Peltier. She's a frequent guest when we talk about finance topics. Hey, Laurie, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Ian. I'm happy to be here again.
Glad to have you. So we are looking at students who are saying, oh my gosh, college. It's time for me to apply. There are some things I should be doing right now. And I think in some cases, also parents who are hearing rumblings about the FAFSA, who are hearing about financial aid deadlines. And I have to say, I empathize with those parents because there are a lot of things that are happening within my kid's school that I'm just paying no attention to. It's like, shouldn't I be signing up for parent-teacher conferences? Or like, isn't there some sort of winter soccer thing? And I'm so busy, I'm not focused on all of that. So I heard that the FAFSA came out in October. What does that mean? What are the deadlines? When do I have to submit? Like, what's my drop dead date to make sure that I've got everything in order if I'm a parent of a senior?
I would say there is no drop dead date. The FAFSA form is open for the next year and a half,
Okay.
but you don't want to wait that long. It depends on the
Gotcha.
schools that you're applying to. So for regular decision, colleges usually set a deadline date for financial aid applications around January 15th.
Okay.
So you've got time. It's November. I would plan on getting it done before the end of the year if I were in this situation. So you know that's something you need to get done. The FAFSA form does allow you to list colleges on there that you want to receive the data. If you don't know exactly which schools you're going to submit an application for, you can still get it done and list one school and go back in later and add the other schools that you've added onto your list. So don't feel the pressure that, oh my gosh, by next week I need to have it done and I need to know exactly where I'm applying. You do have time for that.
Okay.
And you can still submit it after the deadline date, but your qualifications for aid are going to be limited the further past the deadline date you get. So some schools are very strict. This is the date that beyond this date, if we receive your application, there's no funding from the school. You can always get the federal funding throughout the school year, but the funding from the college itself would be limited if you miss the deadline date.
And for some schools, that can be fairly significant, five figure sometimes in terms of that form of aid. So you got to be really on top of things there. What about students that are applying early action, early decision, and want that financial aid award to come back with their admission decision? Do they get an estimate from the school? Do they need to be more proactive in sending in those forms? How does ED and EA play into that process?
So they have earlier deadline dates,
Okay.
Especially early decision, usually November 15th. I've seen some schools where it's November 5th, which is now.
Yeah.
So early decision is the earliest deadline date you're going to see for financial aid. Early action, they want you to get it in early because they want to give you a financial aid offer with your decision. Some schools will postpone the financial decision to a later date, but if you really want to know, yes, I'm accepted and this is how much money I'm getting, then you need to get the financial aid applications done probably by November 15th.
Gotcha. Now, I can imagine some families just intuitively thinking, well, I'm going to wait till January. I'll have more information about my taxes at that point. I got to figure out what my taxes look like. And so I'm not going to do financial aid forms until I know exactly what that is. Is there any relationship between 2021 taxes and fall 2022 seniors entering school?
That's a good point. No, it used to be in the past that way, but now we're looking 2 years back. So
Okay.
The tax return that is reported on these financial aid applications is your 2020 tax return, which should be filed by now. So you know your income for 2020.
Wait, I should have filed that?
Sorry to tell you that.
That's terrible news for me. No, go ahead,
Yeah.
continue.
So all the information you need for the financial aid form you already have.
Okay.
The only thing you may be up in the air about is exactly which colleges you want to receive the data.
Is that part of the reason that there was that big shift to prior years because of this relationship between tax return
Exactly.
filing? Okay. Okay. I
Exactly.
think that's a smart choice. And of course, we've talked many times on the show about appealing financial aid awards if you've had a big shift in your financial circumstances since that 2020 tax year and now, because a lot can have happened over that period of time. Now, we're mostly talking about the FAFSA and maybe a CSS profile, which are forms that we've talked about on past editions of the show. Scholarships tend to be something that colleges will award based on incentives that they want to give students to choose to attend. What about those deadlines that are associated with scholarships? Sometimes those aren't quite as front and center on a school's website, and students might overlook them. What should students be thinking about with respect to the scholarship deadlines?
That's correct. You should do some research on each of the college's websites for the schools you're applying to. We have seen a shift recently where more and more schools are only offering academic scholarships to those students who apply early action or early decision.
Okay.
So kids who are applying regular may miss out on some of that. So you'd want to check and see if you think you're a good candidate for a scholarship at a school, what are their merit scholarship offerings and what are their deadline dates? There's still plenty of schools that offer scholarships to regular decision candidates, but we have seen a little uptick in the numbers of schools who only offer it to early action candidates.
Gotcha. And that's, I mean, part of the reason that as an admissions expert, when I'm working with a student who's looking at, let's say USC, which has that we just talked about, that 12/1 scholarship deadline, I actually don't even know what their regular deadline is, because every single student I work with, I say, you got to apply by December 1st. We want you to be considered for a scholarship. You don't want to miss that opportunity for essentially free money. Now, one of the other pieces that we often discuss is how the conversation around financial aid is really a conversation between students and their parents. It's not just a matter of getting into schools and then mom and dad say, all right, here's your money, go off and have your 4-year education. What are the conversations that families should start to be having now, if they haven't begun, about the process of financing their education?
Right. I think it's important to start now if you haven't already, because that bill is coming up pretty quickly. The bill for the fall semester will be in your inbox in July. So it's just about 8 months away.
Wow.
So having that conversation of how much are you willing to pay? How much are you able to pay? Will the student go into debt for their education? Will the parents go into debt for their child's education? Do you have, other children coming up behind this student that you need to save some of your funding for? Are you paying tuition and fees or room and board as well? Maybe the student can pick up a job this summer and be able to contribute a good portion of money towards the fall and spring semester bill. So just, what's expected of the student, what the parents are planning on doing. I think it's one of my favorite sayings is, what if you apply to these schools and God forbid the student doesn't get in? Well, that's sad. But I think an even sadder situation is, what if the student gets in and the family can't afford it? So, knowing upfront what the cost might be, what your options are for funding, and what you're willing to pay, so that you don't get into that scenario.
It really feels like it's helpful to lay things out on the table. I mean, I've been using this analogy of puzzles lately where, if you're going to start doing a puzzle, it's a really big undertaking, but the first thing you got to do is turn over all the pieces just so you can see that what you're dealing with. And I think you've got to look up, do your net price calculators for each of the schools, figure out what kind of aid you're eligible for, look into filing these forms, and then figure out how much funding can we get from all of the different resources that we have available to us. How much can you get from a summer job? What might you be able to contribute? And of course, the other funding options are going to be loans that are going to come into this process. And you want to get a clear picture of all those other pieces first, but how might loans come into the picture, and when should families start considering that piece of the process?
So loans, you have some time on. I mean, the applications for loans are typically filled out in June and July, even up till August before school starts. Just knowing that the student can borrow a limited amount from the federal government, and any additional funding under the student's name is very, very limited. They would need a co-signer to go on the loan with them. But the parents borrowing, if you have a decent credit score, is unlimited. So knowing that that's an option, and it's more How is my credit score today? Is there a way I could increase my credit score so that I get a better interest rate on some of these loans that are offered?
And we've got lots of different content that we're sharing on our blog, which you can get to at blog.getintocollege.com. Just a lot of really, really great content talking about these different aspects of financial aid. And I think we get into a little bit more the nitty gritty there with some links that you can click on to find more resources. I want to pivot just ever so slightly here to students that maybe have done everything at this point. They've submitted all of their applications and their essays are finished, but maybe they're starting now to think about financial aid. Maybe they took care of all the admission process and now it's, well, now how am I going to pay for this? What about the role of all of these private scholarships? You hear about scholarships that are out there. I can apply for so many of them. When do deadlines for those scholarships tend to be? What are the expectations that students typically need to meet in order to be eligible for those? How should students think about that fitting into their funding puzzle?
That's a good point. I do say for students who are done with their applications, now is a good time to pivot and spend their energy on those outside scholarships. Mm-hmm. The application due dates are all around the calendar. They could have been, May of junior year, October 1st of senior year is a big one. Unfortunately, it's a crunch time for everything. Yeah. But it's still okay to start searching now and just watch the deadline dates and see, what's coming up in the next 2 weeks that I could hit that deadline date for. But it's a good project for those students who are done.
And they're not quite as regimented as what we see with admissions and financial aid applications, where it's November 1st, December 1st, January, like that kind of thing. They're just kind of all over the place. Yeah. Exactly. And I think we've talked about this previously. These scholarships are available to you even after you're a student. So you can continue to apply for different sources of funding. I think a lot of students assume once I start school, my funding is baked into the process. And I'm just going to have to cover this amount out of pocket, but there are ongoing opportunities to continue to contribute to your education.
That's correct.
All right. Any other final tips that you would give families who are starting this process right now, beginning the conversation around the kitchen table?
Divide and conquer. Nice. Maybe if the student is working on their applications, the parents really can get the financial aid applications done where the student should be focusing on their essays and applications.
Yeah, so students, you can be project managers in this case, assign some tasks for your parents, and parents is a great way for you to help while giving your students some space to work on those college essays, which really should be theirs. All right, Laurie, that's great. Thanks for coming and helping to make some sense of all of that process. We've got another great show coming up next week. Again, Beth is going to be back hosting. We'll talk about how to get your best essay put together before your regular decision deadlines. We alluded to that in the first segment where we talked about 2 weeks being the minimum amount of time that you might want to put towards that personal essay. Beth's going to talk about maybe the ideal way to structure that. We'll also talk about maybe considering a gap year, especially if you're a student who is lukewarm on college coming up this fall for whatever reason. What does the gap year mean and how can you take advantage of that? And then we will also talk about loan servicing and what to do when that changes. My mortgage was just sold to a new mortgage servicer, which I hate, but I have no control over. And so now I got to figure that out. So I might get some tips from that segment as well. All right. That was a great show. Thank you so much for joining us. Laurie, it was great to have you. I want to thank all of our guests, and we will see you all again next week. Take care.